Hello, Sophie here, and today I'm going to be talking about the romantic poets I want to read more poems from. So I really love William Wordsworth, as you might have been able to tell from my favourite William Wordsworth poem video and my Lake District / Wordsworth vlog. I love reading his poetry, I love studying his poetry, I love learning more about his life. Along with a group of his friends, he was one of the forerunners of the Romanticism era, also known as the Romantic era, or the Romantic period, or the Romantic movement, which was at its peak around the end of the 18th century, start of the 19th. So Romanticism is a movement which was a way of looking at art forms differently. I'm going to be focusing on the literature side of this, and particularly the Romantics, which were a set of poets writing about their deepest feelings, all emotions, not just love, as the name may suggest. There was a departure from social class boundaries, and this period changed the way poetry was seen. It wasn't just nonsense to be read by scholars in the upper class. Lots of people were writing and reading poetry. A lot of these poets, including William Wordsworth, were trying to use common speech in a beautiful way to stir the reader's emotion. They were writing poetry for people from many walks of life, and they were heavily influenced by nature, their own imaginations and intuition, heroism, rebellion, history, and change. I've dipped my toes into other works of this genre, but definitely not enough, so here are some of the romantic poets I want to read some more poetry from. First up is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was a friend of William Wordsworth. He lived from 1772 to 1834, and apparently his poems feature supernatural elements, possibly influenced by his drug addiction, so that's kind of interesting. I have read a couple of Coleridge poems, but not enough. Next is Lord Byron. He lived from 1788 to 1824, and I first heard of Lord Byron from the TV show Horrible Histories, which was the adaptation of the Terry Deary books. I always get Terry Deary and Terry Pratchett mixed up, but Terry Deary wrote Horrible Histories, and the BBC made like an adaptation of that, and there was a scene in the TV show, like Twitlight, which was obviously a parody of Twilight, and it was Lord Byron being all mysterious and like, this woman thinks he's a vampire, but he's not, he's just a really soppy poet, and that made me laugh, and ever since then I've wanted to read some Lord Byron poems. He was friends with Percy, Bysshe, Shelley, but apparently did not like William Wordsworth and that crowd. Speaking of Percy, Bysshe, Shelley, I want to read some more of his poems. He lived from 1792 to 1822 and was married to Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. As far as I can see, Percy Bysshe Shelley was an atheist. He wrote a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism, which led to him being kicked out of the college he was at. And I find that kind of interesting because a lot of the romantic poets were religious, so that adds a different dynamic. I want to read some John Keats poetry. He lived from 1793 to 1864. No, that's a different person. He lived from 1795 to 1821, and I don't know much about him. I obviously heard the name John Keats when I was studying Wordsworth and other things. I know he's a poet, and that's about it. I don't think he wrote poetry for that long at all before he died, which is kind of amazing that he's so well known, but I know he has got some poetry out there that I want to read. It was John Clare who lived from 1793 to 1864. Clare is sometimes called the peasant poet, which isn't the nicest name, but it tells you something about him. He did come from a more modest background than a lot of the other poets on this list. I'm interested to see if that shows at all in his poetry or influences it in a different way. Jonathan Bate, the renowned Shakespeare scholar, actually wrote a biography on John Clare, and I would like to read that if I like Clare's poetry. Next is Charles Lamb, who lived from 1775 to 1834. He, along with his sister Mary, wrote a children's book called Tales from Shakespeare, which are kind of retellings of Shakespeare's plays for children, which I would like to read that as well as some of his poetry. One of the other random facts I found about Charles Lamb was that him and his sister Mary both suffered from periods of mental illness, and during one of the more severe bouts of that, his sister Mary murdered their mother. Not really have anything to do with his poetry, but I know he did write poetry while he was in a like mental asylum or something, so that would be very interesting to read. Next is Robert Sowerby. Not sure how you pronounce his last name, but he lived from 1774 to 1843, and he was the poet laureate before William Wordsworth. He was a poet laureate from 1813 to 1843, and he knew Wordsworth and Coleridge and all those guys. He was in that kind of club that they had. So yeah, I want to read more Southey poems. W.B. Yeats, or Yeats, who lived from 1865 to 1939, and who in 1923 was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. I don't know anything else about him. I think I've read a couple of Yeats poems, but I don't remember which ones. Then I want to read some Charlotte Turner Smith. She lived from 1749 to 1806, and she also wrote novels and children's books as well as poetry. Unlike a lot of the other poets I want to read, she wasn't inspired by Wordsworth and Coleridge, she actually inspired them, which is pretty awesome. And I want to read some of her novels as well, because apparently she wrote gothic fiction. Next on my list is Anna Latitia Barbauld. Again, not sure about that pronunciation. She lived from 1743 to 1825, and she wrote a lot of different things, including poetry. She wrote a poem called 1811, which criticised Britain's involvement in the Napoleonic Wars, and this was actually her last published work, because she got so much hate for writing this poem that I think it scared her into publishing anything else, and she never did. I want to read more Elizabeth Barrett Browning poems. She lived from 1806 to 1861, and she's the author of How Do I Love Thee, which I've read and which is quite a famous poem. She also apparently influenced Edgar Allan Poe and Emily Dickinson, which is pretty cool. And finally, Helen Maria Williams. I had a few conflicting dates for her life, but she lived sometime around 1760, 61, 62, 59, something like that, to around 1827. She wrote novels, poetry, and she also translated some works. William Wordsworth also wrote a sonnet about her. I think it's called Sonnet on Seeing Helen Maria Williams Weep at a Tale of Distress, or something along those lines. She was kind of portrayed well in that poem, but in some other accounts she was not portrayed so well. I don't know anything about her poetry, but I'm interested to read it and experience more people's works. So there you have it. I've read and loved a lot of William Wordsworth, and he's inspired me to read some more poets, including Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, Percy, Bysshe, Shelley, John Keats, John Clare, Charles Lamb, Robert Southey, W.B. Yeats, Charlotte Turner Smith, Anna Latitia Barbauld, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Helen Maria Williams. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been a while since I actually recorded any videos, so I hope it turned out alright. I might have to change my recording location because I like to record in the morning, and in the morning I get this weird backlighting here. In fact, I'm not even sure if this video is going to be too dark, but hopefully it turned out alright. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and bye!